February 1943. Western Tunisia. A narrow defile called Kasserine Pass cuts through the Atlas Mountains, funneling roads and men into a corridor of dust and stone. On the high ground, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel surveys the battlefield through binoculars. Below him, American units are coming apart. Tanks burn in the open. Abandoned artillery sits silent, their trails dug into the sand. Infantry crowds the roads, retreating. Between February 14th and 22nd, U.S. forces suffer about 6,500 casualties, with nearly 3,000 captured. For Rommel's Africa Corps, including the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, this is more than a win. It confirms what they long believed. The Americans were weak. In 1939, the U.S. Army was only the 19th largest in the world, with about 174,000 active duty soldiers. Germany, on the other hand, had mobilized 4 million since 1933, far exceeding the limits set by the Treaty of Versailles. The Wehrmacht had already shown its skill in Poland, France, and the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. While American factories made cars and refrigerators, German factories made tanks and field guns. Ideology shaped their view of America being too weak. Adolf Hitler often claimed the United States was too divided to fight a long war. German officers remembered U.S. troops in World War I as brave but inexperienced, arriving late in 1917 and fighting in the Meuse-Argonne without leading the overall strategy. Nothing suggested the next generation would be different. And now, at Kasserine, the evidence seems visible in flame and smoke. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the U.S. Second Corps. His headquarters sat roughly 70 miles behind the lines in an elaborate underground bunker. Units were dispersed across a broad front with limited mutual support. Communications were inconsistent. Armor, infantry, and artillery often fought without synchronized coordination. The Germans exploited the seams. German 88mm anti-tank guns, already feared from North Africa to the Eastern Front, fired at American M3 Lee and early M4 Sherman tanks from a distance. American units had no choice but to retreat in confusion as German panzers broke through weak spots. Supply dumps were captured, and prisoners were marched east under guard. For 6 days, the Germans dictated tempo. A critical question emerges at this juncture. If this was proof of American weakness, why did it terrify German commanders just months later? To answer that, we have to step backward before stepping forward. When the United States entered the war after December 7, 1941, its army was unprepared for large-scale continental warfare, but its mobilization capacity was unprecedented. Between 1940 and 1942, the U.S. Army expanded from under 200,000 active duty troops to over 3 million. Training camps across the country are filled with draftees. Louisiana and Carolina maneuvers tested divisions under emulated combat conditions. Army ground forces under General Leslie McNair standardized doctrine and organization. Yet none of that mattered in February 1943, because doctrine does not survive first contact without experience. Kasserine was America's first major engagement against German forces in North Africa, and the experience was unforgiving. Omar Bradley would later describe the defeat as the worst performance of U.S. forces in the war. Eisenhower privately acknowledged system-wide failures. Units lacked combat seasoning. Command cohesion wavered under pressure. Combined arms coordination, so essential to modern warfare, was inconsistent. German intelligence analysts drew a simple conclusion: the Americans were not ready. Rommel wrote home that the Americans had not yet learned how to fight. He was not mocking them. He was making an observation. and for the moment, it was accurate. But what the Germans misunderstood was the difference between inexperience and incapacity. The US Army had demonstrated weakness under fire. It had not demonstrated an inability to change. This is the pivot point, but Kasserine was not America's breaking point. It was its diagnostic test. Within days of the defeat, Dwight D. Eisenhower made decisive changes. Fredendall was relieved. On March 6, 1943, command of 2nd Corps passed to George S. Patton. People often describe Patton's arrival in dramatic terms: strict discipline, polished helmets, and enforced salutes. These visible changes helped morale, but the real change was in how the Army was organized. After-action reports from Kasserine circulated widely. Communications procedures were streamlined. Artillery coordination improved. Fire direction centers, refined during the interwar years at Fort Sill, were implemented with rigor. Instead of isolated batteries responding independently, artillery fire could now be massed rapidly at the battalion or division level. Forward observers were trained to request support across units. The Americans did not conceal their failure. They dissected it. German doctrine emphasized initiative at the tactical level, known as Auftragstaktik. But by 1943, the Wehrmacht was increasingly limited by fuel shortages, loss of manpower, and being stretched overly thin. In contrast, the Americans were entering the war with growing resources. The difference was not yet visible at Kasserine, but it would be. Rommel thought he had judged American capability, but he had only measured where they were at that moment, not where they were headed. In the weeks after Kasserine, U.S. forces retrained intensively. Units rehearsed coordinated defense. Artillery fire missions were standardized. Communication nets tightened. When the Germans attacked again near El Getar on March 23, 1943, the battlefield appeared different. Minefields slowed panzers. Tank destroyers engaged from depth. Infantry held position under fire. Artillery responded with concentration and speed that surprised German crews. Roughly 30 German tanks were destroyed or disabled during the engagement near El Getar. It was not a sweeping Allied triumph, and the 10th Panzer Division was not annihilated. The battlefield did not erupt into a dramatic reversal that would immediately alter the course of the war. Yet the significance of that day did not lie in the scale of the destruction. It lay in the contrast. This was not Kasserine. Rommel noticed the change. The same army that had retreated in February was standing firm in March. For a professional military commander who had spent years studying operational patterns, the timeline itself was striking. 4 weeks is not a normal interval for institutional correction. Armies typically require months, sometimes years, to absorb defeat and internalize reform. What Rommel was observing suggested something unusual about the American capacity to adapt. German assumptions prior to Kasserine had rested on the belief that American weakness was cultural. The United States, in Nazi ideological thinking, was a fragmented society lacking the cohesion and martial tradition of European powers. Its army was inexperienced, its officers untested, its population divided. If those assumptions were correct, improvement would be slow and limited. Cultural deficiencies cannot be corrected quickly. Yet what unfolded after Kasserine suggested that the weakness had not been structural in the way German planners imagined. It had been situational. It had reflected inexperience under fire, inadequate coordination, and flawed command decisions, not an absence of potential. Even so, the Germans did not yet fear American infantry. Confidence in German tactical superiority remained intact. The Wehrmacht had accumulated years of combat experience across Poland, France, the Balkans, North Africa, and the Soviet Union. Its officers were trained in maneuver warfare. Its soldiers were battle-hardened. There was little reason, at that stage, to assume that one improved defensive engagement meant parity. What German commanders did not yet fully appreciate was that the Americans were not merely improving the performance of individual soldiers. They were constructing a system that would amplify the effectiveness of every unit within it. The reforms initiated after Kasserine were not isolated corrections. They were integrated adjustments, centralized artillery coordination through fire direction centers, standardized communications procedures, clearer chains of command, and more rigorous training under realistic combat conditions. This was the beginning of a structural transformation. Systems, once established, do not improve linearly, they compound. A coordinated artillery network increases infantry survivability. Standardized equipment simplifies maintenance and replacement. Efficient logistics sustain tempo. Clear accountability accelerates decision-making. Each component strengthens the others. By late spring 1943, the cumulative effect became visible at the operational level. In May, approximately 275,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia, marking the end of the North African campaign. The Americans who had retreated through Kasserine Pass were now part of the Allied force accepting mass capitulations. The reversal was not dramatic in a single moment, but its implications were unmistakable. For German planners reviewing the campaign, the narrative began to shift. Initial contempt gave way to professional caution. Reports increasingly acknowledged the speed of American adaptation and the growing integration of their firepower and maneuver. But caution is not fear. Fear requires sustained exposure. It requires repeated demonstrations that improvement is not temporary, but accelerating. At this stage, the Germans still believed that experience and tactical doctrine would favor the Wehrmacht in future engagements. They had not yet encountered the full expression of the system that was forming. That realization would come later, on the beaches of Normandy, in the breakout across France, under the artillery storms of the Ardennes, and at the crossings of the Rhine. And when it came, it would be unmistakable. At Kasserine, the Germans believed they had found America's ceiling. They had only experienced its beginning. What started in that mountain pass in Tunisia would resound across Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine. Soon, German officers stopped asking whether Americans could fight. They asked how long they could withstand them. Kasserine did not end in Tunisia. It followed the Americans home, showing up in staff meetings, after-action reports, and in the offices of senior commanders who knew that what failed in February 1943 could not fail again. Within 48 hours of the collapse, Dwight D. Eisenhower began restructuring command in North Africa. Major General Lloyd Fredendall was relieved on March 6, 1943. In his place, Eisenhower appointed George S. Patton to command the U.S. Second Corps. The change was not cosmetic. Patton arrived in Tunisia with a mandate to restore discipline and operational coherence. He immediately issued orders, which were both symbolic and practical. Helmets were to be worn at all times. Weapons inspections were mandatory. Officers were required to remain close to forward positions rather than directing operations from distant headquarters. Patrol activity intensified. Defensive positions were constructed in depth. These measures were visible, but the deeper reforms were procedural. After-action reports from Kasserine were blunt. Communications breakdowns had left units isolated. Armor had operated without infantry protection. Artillery had responded too slowly and too independently. Command relationships between corps, divisions, and subordinate battalions had proven fragile under pressure. The U.S. Army did not conceal these failures. It codified them. Here is the critical distinction. The Germans believed Kasserine proved American weakness. The Americans treated it as a laboratory. Even before the war, American artillery doctrine had evolved at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The concept of centralized fire direction, placing calculation and coordination at the battalion level, allowed any forward observer to request fire from any battery within range. The system emphasized speed, standardization, and massed effect. At Kasserine, that system had not been fully implemented. After Kasserine, it was. Fire Direction Centers, FDCs, were reinforced across Second Corps. Communications nets were simplified. Procedures for requesting, calculating, and executing fire missions were drilled repeatedly. The objective was to reduce response time and eliminate fragmentation between batteries. The results would appear within weeks, but artillery was only one element of reform. Training intensified across the Mediterranean theater. Infantry units rehearsed defensive coordination with armor. Tank destroyer battalions were repositioned for depth rather than exposure. Engineers were tasked with preparing integrated defensive obstacles instead of isolated strongpoints. Patton led with an aggressive and dramatic style, pushing units to move quickly. But the real change happened in the Army as a whole, not just because of one leader. Behind the scenes, the War Department in Washington accelerated standardization. Equipment compatibility was prioritized. Ammunition calibers were streamlined. Replacement flows were reorganized to reduce disruption to frontline cohesion. The American Army was beginning to operate as a system rather than a collection of units. On March 23, 1943, barely 4 weeks after the worst phase of Kasserine, German forces attacked near El Guetar. This time, American positions were prepared. Minefields channeled advancing panzers. Tank destroyers of the 601st Battalion engaged from concealed terrain. Infantry of the 1st Infantry Division held defensive lines under sustained pressure. And the artillery responded differently. Fire missions were concentrated quickly. Batteries massed fire through coordinated command channels. German tank crews reported heavier and more accurate bombardment than they had encountered in February. Approximately 30 German tanks were destroyed or disabled during the engagement. The German 10th Panzer Division failed to achieve a breakthrough. The Americans had not become tactically brilliant overnight. They had become coordinated. 4 weeks earlier, American units collapsed under armored pressure. Now they were absorbing and repelling it. Rommel took notice. In correspondence and later writings, he acknowledged that American forces improved rapidly after Tunisia. What had appeared amateurish in February was evolving by spring. But improvement in the field was only part of the story. The deeper transformation transpired at scale. In 1942, the United States had produced over 24,000 aircraft. In 1943, production nearly doubled. Tank output increased steadily, with thousands of M4 Shermans rolling off assembly lines. But more important than volume was uniformity. German forces, by contrast, were increasingly dependent on a patchwork of equipment: Panzer IVs, Panthers, captured French tanks, Czech-built chassis, and assorted assault guns. Ammunition types varied. Spare parts were inconsistent. Logistics became complex. The Americans standardized aggressively. A 105mm shell manufactured in Michigan fits a howitzer deployed in Tunisia without modification. Replacement parts matched production runs. Maintenance procedures were consistent across units. Standardization simplified resupply. Resupply sustained tempo. Tempo determined initiative. Meanwhile, training doctrine across the U.S. Army emphasized combined arms integration. Infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers rehearsed coordination in increasingly realistic exercises. Units rotated through combat zones to gain experience without total exhaustion. By May 1943, the North African campaign ended with the surrender of approximately 275,000 Axis troops in Tunisia. The Americans who had retreated at Kasserine were part of the Allied force accepting capitulation. For German intelligence officers reviewing the campaign, something was unclear. How had improvement occurred so rapidly? The Wehrmacht had invested years refining blitzkrieg doctrine. American forces had required weeks to correct fundamental errors. The response lay in structure. The United States was not bound by doctrinal rigidity. It could replace commanders without political paralysis. It could shift production priorities without destabilizing supply chains. It could retrain divisions without exhausting manpower reserves. Its war machine was expanding, not contracting. By late spring 1943, the question in German headquarters was no longer, are the Americans capable? It was, how quickly are they improving? And the speed seemed unsettling. The reforms that followed Kasserine would resound in Sicily in July 1943 and Italy later that year. They would mature further by June 1944 in Normandy. But the transformation started here. In the humiliation of Tunisia, the Americans had been tested. They had failed. And then they had adjusted. Kasserine did not break the U.S. Army. It refined it. From this point forward, every American engagement would carry the recollection of that defeat and the institutional lessons drawn from it. Rommel believed he had witnessed the limits of American fighting capacity. He had witnessed the beginning of its acceleration. And once acceleration is supported by strong industry and flexible organization, it becomes much more dangerous than just having strength at the start. Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history began to move. Across the English Channel, an armada of more than 5,000 vessels carried Allied troops toward the coast of Normandy. By nightfall, approximately 156,000 Allied soldiers would be ashore. Of those, roughly 73,000 were American, landing at Utah and Omaha beaches as part of D-Day. The operation was the result of years of preparation in logistics, industry, and strategy. But for the German defenders of the Atlantic Wall, it was not yet proof that the Americans were superior. At Omaha Beach, it looked like proof of American vulnerability. The U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced elements of the experienced German 352nd Infantry Division. The beach was narrow, overlooked by bluffs fortified with machine gun nests, artillery positions, and interlocking fields of fire. The first waves encountered chaos. Landing craft were blown off course. Units became intermixed. Many amphibious tanks sank in rough seas before reaching shore. As ramps dropped, soldiers were cut down in exposed surf. By midday, casualties on Omaha exceeded 3,000 killed, wounded, or missing. To German observers inland, early reports were encouraging. The Americans were pinned. The landing appeared disorganized. For a few hours, the beachhead remained in doubt. If the Germans had counterattacked immediately with full armored reserves, the invasion might have been contained. But that counterattack did not come. German command was confused, made worse by Adolf Hitler's strict control, since he kept authority over panzer reserves. This delayed a decisive response. Several armored divisions waited inland for clear orders. Meanwhile, the American small unit initiative began to assert itself. Company officers and non-commissioned officers regrouped scattered men behind shingle banks and obstacles. Engineers cleared lanes under fire. naval gunfire from battleships offshore began targeting fortified positions on the bluffs. By late afternoon, American units had climbed the heights. The beachhead did not collapse. It solidified, and once solidified, it began to expand. Within 48 hours, over 300,000 Allied troops were ashore across all beaches. Artificial mulberry harbors were constructed off the coast to facilitate unloading. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was prepared to pump fuel directly from Britain to France. Temporary piers, pontoon causeways, and continuous naval shuttle operations kept material flowing. The invasion was more than just an attack. It brought a whole support system to the shore. German commanders had anticipated a landing. They had not anticipated the scale and speed of sustainment. By June 12th, more than 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 100,000 tons of supplies had landed in Normandy. The Americans were not improvising supplies. They were flooding the coastline with it. Yet inland, progress slowed. Beyond the beaches lay the bocage, ancient Norman farmland divided by thick earthen hedgerows. Some rose 12 to 15 feet high, reinforced via centuries of root systems and compacted soil. Each field formed a natural fortress. German defenders positioned machine guns and anti-tank weapons to cover narrow approaches. Tanks attempting to climb the embankments exposed thin belly armor to Panzerfaust and PaK 40 fire. American advances in June 1944 were measured in yards. Casualties mounted. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt believed the terrain favored defense. He expected American momentum to stall permanently. The pattern he assumed would repeat. Initial shock, followed by stagnation. But stagnation did not become paralysis. It became experimentation. The bocage did not defeat the Americans. It forced them to invent. Infantry units developed new clearing techniques. Squads advanced along hedgerow bases rather than cresting them. Coordination between tanks and foot soldiers tightened. Engineers experimented with explosives to breach earthen barriers. The most famous adaptation came from Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division. After seeing German steel beach obstacles called Czech hedgehogs scattered along the coast, Cullen suggested welding steel prongs to the front of Sherman tanks. This homemade device lets tanks break through hedgerows at ground level instead of trying to climb over them. General Omar Bradley observed a demonstration and immediately ordered mass production. Within weeks, thousands of hedgerow cutters were fabricated and installed. By mid-July, a majority of American tanks in the First Army were equipped. The Germans had built fortifications to channel movement. The Americans built tools to erase them. This change did not start with official rules or plans. It began with soldiers making things up in the field, and then leaders approved and spread the idea. German officers later acknowledged surprise at how quickly the Americans neutralized what they had assumed was a decisive defensive edge. The next phase would magnify that surprise. On July 25, 1944, the Americans launched Operation Cobra. The objective was to break through the German line near St. Lo and escape the hedgerow stalemate. The preparation was staggering. Approximately 1,500 heavy bombers from the U.S. 8th Air Force conducted a concentrated carpet bombing of a narrow German defensive corridor. The bombardment zone measured roughly 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles deep. At the center of the target sat Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's most elite armored formations, composed of veteran instructors and veteran crews. The bombing devastated the division. More than 1,000 German soldiers were killed in hours. Many more were wounded. Vehicles were destroyed or disabled. communications collapsed. When the ground assault followed the massive aerial bombardment of Operation Cobra, the German defensive line did not merely bend, it fractured. The concentrated bombing had disrupted communications, shattered unit cohesion, and inflicted severe personnel and equipment losses. Panzer Lehr Division, positioned near the center of the bombardment zone, suffered especially heavy damage. Of approximately 45 operational armored vehicles before the attack, only 7 were reportedly capable of movement afterward. The division, once regarded as one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable formations, had been rendered combat ineffective in a matter of hours. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr, later described the bombardment as unlike anything his troops had previously experienced. It was not simply heavy artillery or routine tactical air support. It was the application of overwhelming industrial force concentrated on a narrow operational objective. The scale and coordination of the bombing disrupted not only material assets, but command structure and morale. German doctrine had long emphasized rapid maneuver, blitzkrieg, built on concentrated armor, speed, and operational surprise. In 1940 and 1941, that doctrine had delivered extraordinary success. But what unfolded in Normandy in July 1944 was something fundamentally different. The American breakthrough was not powered solely by speed or tactical ingenuity. It was enabled by scale, by the ability to apply overwhelming air power, follow it immediately with ground assault, and sustain exploitation through logistical depth. Through the shattered corridor near St. Lo, American armored columns began to move with increasing momentum. The breakthrough was not tentative, it was expanded. On August 1, 1944, George S. Patton activated the U.S. Third Army, positioning it to exploit the rupture in the German line. What followed was one of the most rapid operational advances of the war in Western Europe. Within weeks, American forces were advancing across France at extraordinary pace. Between August 1st and August 31st, Third Army covered more than 600 miles. Key cities fell in succession, including Le Mans and Chartres. German defensive positions were bypassed rather than attacked head-on, isolated rather than systematically reduced. Units that had expected time to reorganize found themselves encircled or cut off from supply routes before they could establish coherent resistance. The culmination of this acceleration came in mid-August with the encirclement known as the Falaise Pocket. As American forces advanced from the south and Canadian formations pressed from the north, approximately 50,000 German troops were trapped in a narrowing corridor. Large quantities of equipment were abandoned or destroyed. The German 7th Army, already weakened, ceased to function as an effective, coordinated fighting force. For German commanders, the implications were profound. Operational maneuver warfare had long been regarded as a German specialty. The Wehrmacht had refined the integration of armor, motorized infantry, and close air support in earlier campaigns. Yet in France in 1944, American armored divisions were conducting sweeping advances at a tempo that the German army struggled to counter. Defensive lines could not stabilize quickly enough. Reinforcements could not arrive in time. Retreat routes were cut before orderly withdrawal was possible. However, the speed of the American advance, impressive as it was, did not exist in isolation. Momentum on that scale cannot be sustained by maneuver alone. It depends on fuel, ammunition, spare parts, maintenance crews, transport vehicles, and a continuous flow of replacement personnel and equipment. By late summer 1944, it became increasingly clear that the American army in France was not operating as an independent field force. It was the forward edge of a much larger system. Fuel was delivered in vast quantities through coordinated trucking networks, such as the Red Ball Express. Standardized vehicles and equipment simplified maintenance and replacement. Artillery units remained mobile and responsive, moving forward in support of advancing formations. Air superiority ensured that German attempts to reorganize or reposition were vulnerable to attack. The breakthrough at Cobra and the rapid advance that followed were therefore not isolated examples of tactical brilliance. They were demonstrations of integrated capacity. The American Army was no longer merely reacting to German maneuvers. It was shaping the operational environment through sustained pressure, logistical resilience, and coordinated firepower. German commanders had initially interpreted American setbacks as evidence of cultural or structural weakness. By August 1944, that interpretation had become untenable. What they were confronting in France was not an army improvising success. It was an army supported by an industrial and logistical framework capable of amplifying every tactical gain. Speed, in this context, was not the primary weapon. It was the visible expression of something deeper. The Red Ball Express, launched August 25, 1944, mobilized nearly 6,000 trucks operating around the clock. Mainly driven by African American soldiers, the convoy network delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies daily to forward units. Fuel shortages crippled German maneuver. The Americans rarely faced such constraints. Standardized equipment simplified repairs. Replacement vehicles arrived rapidly from depots. Ammunition flowed continuously. By September 1944, German soldiers confronting American forces in France were no longer engaging what appeared to be isolated combat units. What stood before them was something more complex and more difficult to contain, a continuously advancing logistical organism. American divisions did not merely attack and pause. They advanced with the assurance that fuel, ammunition, and replacements would follow. This altered the psychological landscape of the battlefield in subtle but profound ways. German officer reports from late summer increasingly described American firepower as overwhelming, not simply because of its volume, but because of its coordination. Artillery concentrations arrived with remarkable speed. Forward observers relayed coordinates through centralized fire direction centers, allowing guns miles apart to mass their fire on a single objective within minutes. What German troops experienced was not sporadic bombardment, but layered response. Resistance was met not only by infantry assault, but by rapidly concentrated artillery and immediate air support. American air superiority reinforced this sense of exposure. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs patrolled aggressively over road networks and supply routes. Daylight movement for German units became increasingly hazardous. Columns attempting to reposition were vulnerable to strafing and rocket attacks. Fuel convoys were especially targeted, compounding existing shortages. Even the smallest details began to carry weight. German veterans later recalled the distinctive silhouette of the L-4 Piper Cub observation aircraft circling overhead. Unarmed and slow, it appeared harmless at first glance. Yet within minutes of its arrival, artillery fire often followed. The aircraft symbolized a system in which observation, calculation, and execution were tightly integrated. Concealment alone was no longer sufficient. Detection meant rapid response. The Americans, in effect, had not merely landed troops on June 6, 1944. They had transported across the Channel a coordinated framework of production, logistics, communication, and fire control. The initial landings at Omaha had nearly failed under heavy resistance, yet the beachhead absorbed the shock. In the hedgerow country, American units struggled but adapted, developing mechanical solutions such as hedgerow cutters and refining small unit coordination. At St. Lo, concentrated air power and artillery shattered elite German formations. In the breakout that followed, armored columns advanced across France at a tempo that overwhelmed attempts at stabilization. By late summer, German officers conducting operational reviews could no longer frame the Normandy campaign as a temporary Allied advantage or a product of numerical superiority alone. What they were observing was institutional acceleration. The Americans had not simply survived the Normandy landings, they had matured within them. The precarious foothold on June 6th had expanded into a resilient operational platform capable of sustained maneuver. This recognition marked a decisive shift in German assessment. In February 1943, American defeat at Kasserine Pass had reinforced the belief that U.S. forces were inexperienced and structurally inferior. That interpretation had rested on the assumption that cultural and organizational weaknesses would limit long-term performance. Normandy dismantled that assumption. The question confronting German planners by September 1944 was no longer whether American troops could fight effectively. It was whether the momentum generated by American integration, industry feeding logistics, logistics sustaining maneuver, maneuver supported by rapid fire coordination, could be halted at all. The transformation was not sentimental, and it did not inspire admiration among German commanders. It inspired calculation. They began to measure American operations not in isolated engagements, but in cumulative effect. Each defensive success achieved by German units seemed temporary. Each American setback appeared to be absorbed and corrected. What had once seemed obvious in February 1943, the belief that American forces lacked staying power, had dissolved in Normandy. In its place emerged a more sober evaluation. The United States possessed the capacity to learn, scale, and sustain operations across extended fronts. And calculation of that kind inevitably carried psychological weight. When an opponent demonstrates not only strength, but growth. The strategic horizon narrows. The challenge is no longer winning the next engagement. It is preventing a widening imbalance. By the autumn of 1944, German soldiers and officers alike understood that they were no longer confronting an inexperienced expeditionary force. They were confronting a system that had proven capable of adaptation under fire, reinforcement under strain, and expansion under pressure. The illusion of weakness had not simply faded. It had been replaced by an awareness that the Americans were unlikely to plateau. And that awareness marked the beginning of something deeper than caution. It marked the beginning of fear. When Operation Cobra ruptured the German line near Saint-Lô in late July 1944, the breach did not widen gradually. It exploded. On August 1, 1944, the U.S. Third Army was formally activated under George S. Patton. What followed was not a careful advance. It was one of the fastest operational drives in modern military history. Within days, American armored columns poured through the breach in the German front. Instead of pressing forward in a narrow corridor, Patton fanned his forces outward, west into Brittany, south toward the Loire, and east toward Le Mans and beyond. The tempo shocked German commanders. Between August 1st and August 31st, 1944, the Third Army advanced over 600 miles. Entire regions of western France were liberated in weeks. German units, already confused by the bombing at Cobra, struggled to re-establish defensive coherence. This was no longer the hedgerow war of June. This was movement on a much larger scale. The Wehrmacht had invented blitzkrieg. Now it was being outrun. German doctrine emphasized speed, concentrated armor, and deep penetration to unbalance opponents. In 1940, it had broken France in 6 weeks. In 1941, It had driven hundreds of miles into the Soviet Union within months. But by late 1944, German mobility was constrained. Fuel shortages plagued panzer divisions. Allied bombing campaigns had targeted synthetic fuel plants in the Reich. Rail networks were disrupted. Replacement vehicles were scarce. The Americans, by contrast, were fighting at the front of an expanding supply line. The difference was not just bold leadership, it was also in how well they managed supplies. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express was set up to keep the advance moving quickly. This trucking network ran day and night, using nearly 6,000 vehicles each day. It delivered about 12,000 tons of supplies daily to the front lines. Fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts flowed continuously. German units frequently relied on horse-drawn transport. By 1944, the Wehrmacht still employed over 600,000 horses for logistics. Mechanized formations frequently halted for lack of gasoline. The Americans rarely halted for long. Standardization magnified the effect. U.S. divisions operated with largely uniform equipment. Replacement Sherman tanks fit fluently into units. Artillery ammunition was compatible across formations. They could now keep moving quickly without stopping. Patton understood this and exploited it relentlessly. His columns bypassed strong points rather than reducing them frontally. They cut communications, seized crossroads, and isolated German formations before they could reorganize. One of the most decisive moments came in mid-August with the encirclement known as the Falaise Pocket. As Allied forces converged, American units from the south and Canadian forces from the north, German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped in a shrinking corridor. Approximately 50,000 German troops were encircled. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. Large quantities of equipment were destroyed or abandoned. The pocket marked the effective collapse of organized German resistance in Normandy. For the Germans, this was the psychological turning point. The Americans were no longer reacting. They were dictating tempo. German commanders, who had previously dismissed American inexperience, were now scrambling to prevent encirclement. Defensive lines were formed and broken in rapid succession. Units retreated eastward in disorder. Yet even as American forces advanced rapidly, they encountered a new constraint. Fuel consumption outpaced delivery in September 1944. The advance slowed temporarily as supply lines stretched beyond planned limits. This pause taught an important lesson. It revealed that even the American machine had limits. But those limits were about supplies, not about how the army was organized. As supply systems adjusted, momentum resumed. Meanwhile, German forces attempted to stabilize along the Siegfried Line. Reinforcements were rushed from other fronts, but they faced a different opponent than in 1940. The Americans combined maneuver with overwhelming fire support. Artillery remained decisive. Fire direction centers allowed rapid concentration of guns at critical points. Forward observers coordinated closely with advancing units. When resistance stiffened, massed artillery preceded renewed assault. Close air support intensified. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. German daylight movement became hazardous. Fuel convoys and armored columns were frequently targeted from the air. Now, the battlefield worked as a team, with help coming from the air and from supply lines in the rear. An American infantry advance did not represent 150 men. It represented artillery behind them, trucks behind that, and aircraft overhead. This assimilation magnified psychological pressure. German reports increasingly described American advances as relentless. It was not simply that they moved fast. It was that they kept up the pressure and did not seem to get tired. Here is what unsettled German commanders most. The Americans did not need perfect tactics. They needed sustained tempo. German divisions, weakened by casualties and shortages, could not absorb repeated operational shocks. When lines were breached, recovery time shortened. Defensive depth eroded. The encirclement at the Falaise pocket had demonstrated vulnerability. The continued American drive across France reinforced it. Patton's forces reached the Moselle River by September. Other American armies advanced toward Belgium and the German border. By the summer of 1944, the transformation that had begun after Kasserine Pass was no longer subtle. In February 1943, American units had broken under concentrated armored assault. 18 months later, American armored formations were executing sweeping encirclements that trapped entire German armies. The contrast was stark, but it was not the product of sudden brilliance or isolated heroics. It was cumulative. The reforms implemented after Kasserine had compounded over time. Training standards tightened. Command accountability improved. Artillery coordination became faster and more centralized. Industrial production ensured standardized equipment and steady replacement. Logistics sustained advances that would have stalled less prepared forces. Air superiority restricted German movement and reinforced ground operations. Operational audacity, encouraged at higher levels of command, ensured that breakthroughs were exploited rather than cautiously consolidated. The visible expression of all this was speed. American advances across France were not merely rapid, they were sustained. Their tempo reflected the strength of the organization behind them, an integration of doctrine, supply, communication, and firepower that functioned as a unified whole. For German officers, this demanded recalibration. Early war confidence had rested heavily on maneuver superiority, the belief that German doctrine and experience would allow them to outpace and outthink their opponents. By late 1944, that assumption was no longer secure. Maneuver itself had become contested terrain, and in several sectors, the Americans were now dictating it. When American units advanced, they did so with supply depth that made counterattacks difficult. When breakthroughs occurred, they were exploited immediately, not tentatively. The Wehrmacht found itself reacting rather than initiating, and reaction in war erodes confidence. By late summer 1944, the illusion that Americans were tactically naive had evaporated. They were not flawless. They made errors. They occasionally overextended, but they learned quickly. And once momentum began, it compounded. Speed had become a weapon, not just for moving fast, but for throwing the enemy off balance. German planning cycles have been shortened. Defensive lines formed under pressure. Fuel shortages compounded stress. And every mile gained by American columns narrowed German options. The collapse in France was not a single event. It was an acceleration. It started as reform in Tunisia, grew into adaptation in Normandy, and now showed itself as control of the battlefield in France. The Germans once had measured American weakness by the retreat at Kasserine. Now they measured American strength by how fast it could encircle them. And the difference between those two measurements defined the war's turning point in the West. By late 1944, German soldiers on the Western Front had learned to fear many things. They feared the thunder of Allied bombers overhead. They feared armored columns appearing behind defensive lines. They feared encirclement. But when veterans were asked after the war what weapon they feared most, many gave the same answer: American artillery. Not tanks, not infantry, not even aircraft. It was the artillery. To understand why, we have to move beyond volume and into the system. Before the war, the United States had invested heavily in artillery doctrine during the interwar years. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, officers refined methods of centralized fire control that differed significantly from European models. In many armies, including Germany's, artillery batteries were often assigned to specific units. Forward observers communicated primarily with their own battery. Coordination across larger formations was possible, but slower and less centralized. The American system emphasized battalion-level fire direction centers, FDCs. Instead of each battery calculating independently, firing data was centralized. Any forward observer could request fire from any battery within range. Requests could escalate rapidly from battalion to division, or even corps-level massing. This system made the response much faster. In many cases, American artillery could respond to a fire request in approximately 3 minutes. German systems regularly required 10 to 12. On a battlefield where every second counts, that difference was important. The Germans did not fear American artillery because it was loud. They feared it because it was fast. By the time American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, artillery units were fully integrated into combined arms doctrine. Each U.S. infantry division fielded 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers, 36 guns total, 1 battalion of 155mm howitzers, 12 guns. Attached corps-level artillery available for reinforcement. By mid-1944, over 8,500 American field artillery pieces were deployed in the European theater. But numbers alone do not explain the psychological effect. What terrified German soldiers was coordination. The Americans perfected a technique known as time on target, TOT. In a TOT mission, batteries at varying distances calculated firing times so that shells from multiple guns would land simultaneously within a few seconds of each other. There was no ranging shot, no gradual escalation. There would be silence. Then, suddenly, a wave of shells would land at the same time. For troops in the impact zone, it seemed as if the sky had opened all at once. German accounts frequently described TOT bombardments as overwhelming and without warning. At Elsenborn Ridge during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, American artillery demonstrated this coordination on a massive scale. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West. Over 1,600 German guns opened fire along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes. Initially, surprise achieved penetration in some sectors, but at Elsenborn Ridge, U.S. 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions, supported by massed artillery, held firm. Approximately 348 American artillery pieces were concentrated in defensive support. When German armored units advanced, they were met not only by infantry resistance, but by rapid, coordinated artillery fire. German assault waves stalled. Repeated attacks failed. The 6th SS Panzer Army, considered one of Germany's elite formations, could not break through. German General Hasso von Manteuffel later acknowledged the decisive role of American artillery in blunting the offensive. The ridge did not collapse. It absorbed and repelled. For the first time, elite German armored formations were being stopped not by superior maneuver, but by superior coordination of fire. Then came another development, which increased the fear. In December 1944, the Americans introduced the VT, variable time, proximity fuse into ground combat. The VT fuse, which cost over $1 billion to develop, second only to the Manhattan Project, had a small radar set inside the artillery shell. As the shell fell, it sensed how close it was to the ground and exploded at the best height, usually about 30 feet above the surface. The effect was devastating. Traditional shells are often planted in soil before exploding, limiting fragmentation against entrenched troops. Proximity-fused shells burst mid-air, scattering shrapnel downward into foxholes and trenches that previously offered protection. Effectiveness against infantry increased dramatically. Estimates suggest 5 to 10 times more lethal in certain conditions. German prisoners captured during the Ardennes offensive reported preferring to assault American positions rather than remain under airburst bombardment. They described the psychological effect as unbearable. Shells no longer needed to land precisely inside a trench to be lethal. They exploded above it. Artillery could now strike from above as well as from the side. Meanwhile, American logistics ensured that artillery never ran dry. Battery C of the 337th Field Artillery Battalion reportedly fired its 300,000th round between June 1944 and March 1945. For the Rhine crossing in March 1945, over 2,000 American guns opened fire. In one preparatory bombardment, more than 65,000 shells were fired in just over an hour. German artillery units could not match this sustained output. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht faced severe ammunition shortages. Many batteries relied on captured or mixed origin equipment, complicating supply chains. Different calibers required different ammunition types. Spare parts were inconsistent. The Americans, by contrast, standardized. A shell produced in Ohio fit guns in France without modification. Replacement parts were compatible across units. This organized system made it possible to keep up heavy, focused fire without stopping. It wasn't only the number of guns, it was the certainty that they would keep firing. German soldiers began to dread specific signs. The remote hum of a small aircraft overhead, often an L-4 Piper Cub observation plane, meant that artillery might soon follow. These light aircraft, unarmed and slow, were used to direct fire from above. Once an observer spotted movement, coordinates were transmitted to FDCs. Minutes later, shells would fall. German troops learned that concealment alone was insufficient. Mobility during daylight became dangerous. American artillery also supported rapid maneuver. When Patton's forces advanced across France, artillery moved with them. Motorized transport allowed batteries to reposition quickly. Fire support remained close to the progressing units. This integration reinforced tempo. The Germans could not isolate American infantry from its supporting fires. The battlefield now had many levels of support working together. Infantry advanced, artillery suppressed, air support interdicted, logistics sustained. And at the heart of it all was artillery, steady, quick to respond, and relentless. Post-war interviews with German officers repeatedly returned to the same observation. American artillery was the most effective and feared weapon on the Western Front. Not because German artillery was incompetent. German gunners were skilled and disciplined. But because American artillery operated within a wider system that increased its impact. Centralized coordination, standardized supply, rapid communication, industrial depth. The artillery stayed relentless. By 1945, German soldiers confronting American units understood that any engagement might escalate rapidly. A skirmish could become a barrage. A defensive line could become a crater field. And there was rarely a pause long enough to regroup. The fear was not of a single shell. It was inevitable. The inevitability was that once American guns began firing, they would not stop until resistance collapsed. The illusion of American weakness born at Kasserine had long since disappeared. In its place was something more impersonal. An army that had learned to coordinate steel with mathematics. And on the receiving end, German troops learned that modern war was no longer decided by courage alone. It was decided by systems. And in artillery, the American system proved unforgiving. By late 1944, German soldiers on the Western Front had formed clear opinions about the armies they faced. They respected the British. They regarded the Canadians as aggressive and strong, but they described the Americans differently. To understand why, we need to look closely at how the armies were built, how they fought, and what rules they followed. This is not about myths or national pride. Let's begin with the British. The British Army entered the Second World War with painful lessons from 1940 and North Africa. The collapse in France, the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the grinding desert campaigns under Bernard Montgomery shaped British operational philosophy by 1944. Montgomery emphasized deliberate, heavily prepared offensives. Set-piece battles were planned in detail. Artillery preparation was extensive. Supplies were carefully staged before major assaults. Operations such as Goodwood and Epsom near Caen in June and July 1944 reflected this doctrine. Large armored thrusts preceded by methodical bombardment. German officers often described British attacks as predictable in timing and approach. That predictability did not mean weakness. British artillery was powerful. Infantry discipline was high. Defensive positions were organized and stubborn. But when attacks are predictable, they are less shocking to the enemy. German commanders feared British strength. They did not fear British surprise. British offensives typically occurred after clear artillery preparation. German intelligence and aerial reconnaissance could often anticipate concentrations of forces. Even when British advances were costly and slow, they were methodical. The German army, trained in flexible defensive maneuver, could adapt to set-piece offensives more easily than to fluid exploitation. Now consider the Canadians. Canadian forces, particularly in Normandy and the Scheldt in late 1944, earned a reputation for toughness. At Caen, during the closing of the Falaise Pocket, and later in clearing the Scheldt estuary in the autumn of 1944, Canadian units fought in difficult terrain under heavy resistance. German accounts frequently described Canadians as aggressive in close combat. Some German veterans remarked on their willingness to press attacks despite casualties. But Canada did not operate independently at the same industrial scale as the United States. Canadian divisions were formidable tactically. They were not backed by a continental production machine of equal size. German soldiers feared the Canadians in the field. They feared the Americans across the map. The real difference was in how the armies were organized. American doctrine after 1943 increasingly emphasized mobility, rapid exploitation, and operational tempo. While British forces frequently paused to secure their gains and plan the next attack, American forces were more likely to push forward right away, even if it meant sometimes stretching themselves too thin. This difference was visible after Operation Cobra in July 1944. As British and Canadian forces continued grinding combat around Caen, George S. Patton's Third Army advanced across western France at extraordinary speed. Between August 1st and August 31st, the Third Army advanced over 600 miles. German commanders did not describe British forces as overwhelming. They described Americans that way. Why? American offensives often combined rapid maneuver with overwhelming fire support. An American infantry attack rarely operated in isolation. If resistance stiffened, artillery was massed quickly via centralized fire direction centers. Close air support was requested via forward air controllers. Motorized logistics sustained tempo. The British possessed powerful artillery and armor. The Canadians demonstrated ferocity and discipline. But the Americans combined speed with industrial depth. The Germans were not measuring courage, they were measuring endurance. By late 1944, German divisions were chronically under strength. Fuel shortages were acute. Rail networks were disrupted by Allied bombing. British offensives, though powerful, were often localized and sequential. American offensives, once initiated, tended to expand. After the breakout from Normandy, American forces did not simply advance toward a single objective. They fanned outward: Brittany, the Loire, the Moselle, forcing German units to react across multiple sectors simultaneously. This widened the operational burden on the Wehrmacht. German officers repeatedly noted that American forces could absorb setbacks without losing overall momentum. If one axis stalled, another advanced. In contrast, British offensives were frequently concentrated along narrower fronts. The American way of fighting kept building pressure on the enemy. When Germans heard British artillery, they prepared for a battle. When they heard American artillery, they prepared for escalation. American artillery, supported by standardized logistics and rapid communication, could be massed unexpectedly and repeatedly. German soldiers reported that American artillery response times were often shorter and more concentrated than those of other Allied forces. The real mental impact came from how unpredictable and large the American attacks were. This is not a judgment of superiority in every tactical engagement. In small unit encounters, German infantry often retained confidence in their own training. But the war in 1944 to 1945 was rarely decided by isolated engagements. It was decided which side could sustain operational momentum across weeks and months. The United States, by virtue of industrial production, over 90,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, tens of thousands of tanks, and millions of artillery shells, could sustain that momentum more effectively. Canadian divisions fought vigorously. British divisions fought professionally. American divisions fought within an expanding system. And that system made it hard for the enemy to win in just one place. German commanders respected British planning. They respected Canadian determination. But they feared that the Americans could always bring in more force, because escalation implied that whatever resistance they mounted today could be multiplied tomorrow. The difference was not nationality. It was about being connected. American infantry was connected to artillery, to air support, to supply chains stretching across the Atlantic. British and Canadian forces were formidable components of Allied success. But when German veterans later described the Western Front, their language shifted noticeably when referring to Americans. They used words such as overwhelming, material superiority, relentless. It was not admiration. It was a calculation born of repeated experience. And that calculation shaped how German commanders prepared for the final months of the war. By early 1945, German forces in the West were no longer maneuvering for victory. They were maneuvering for delay. France had been liberated. Belgium is largely cleared. The Ardennes offensive, Battle of the Bulge, had failed to split the Allied front. What remained between the Western Allies and the industrial heartland of Germany was the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been more than geography. It was a defensive symbol, wide, fast-moving, and lined with elevated banks, ideal for artillery and machine gun fire. German planners assumed that if they could not stop the Allies in France, they would stop them at the Rhine. But by March 1945, the strategic situation was collapsing faster than German command could stabilize it. The question was no longer whether the Americans could cross the Rhine. It was how quickly. On March 7, 1945, advance elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. German engineers had prepared to demolish it, but when explosives were triggered, the bridge remained standing, damaged, yet intact. American commanders made an immediate decision. They would cross. Within hours, infantry units were moving across the bridge under intermittent artillery fire. Engineers worked feverishly to reinforce damaged sections. German attempts to destroy the structure with air attacks and V-2 rockets failed to dislodge the bridgehead. Within 24 hours, thousands of American troops were east of the Rhine. Within days, over 25,000 had crossed. This was not a carefully staged river assault. It was a chance taken right away. The German High Command had expected a deliberate buildup before any crossing. Instead, they faced a foothold established almost by surprise. In 1943, the Americans had been surprised at Kasserine. In 1945, they were the ones creating surprise. Remagen was not the only crossing. On March 23 to 24, 1945, the Allies launched Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Montgomery's planned crossing north of the Ruhr, supported by Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. American forces participated alongside British formations. The preparatory artillery barrage was immense. For the Rhine crossing in the U.S. 9th Army sector alone, approximately 2,070 artillery pieces opened fire. More than 65,000 shells were fired in just over an hour. The scale dwarfed many earlier engagements. German defenders, already strained by shortages of ammunition and fuel, faced saturation from artillery, air support, and armor. Pontoon bridges were assembled under covering fire. Engineers worked continuously despite counter-battery attempts. Within days, multiple Allied armies were established east of the Rhine. The so-called final barrier did not stop the Allies. The Rhine had been Germany's last natural line of defense. It fell in days. Once across the river, American forces accelerated again. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial center, became the next objective. In early April 1945, the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies encircled the Ruhr pocket. Approximately 300,000 German troops were trapped. The encirclement occurred with the same characteristics seen earlier in France: rapid maneuver, sustained logistics, coordinated fire support. German resistance varied from determined local defense to disorganized surrender. By April 18th, organized resistance in the Ruhr had collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were processed. For German officers observing events unfold, the pattern was unmistakable. American operations did not stall at obstacles. They pushed even harder through these obstacles. At Kasserine, German commanders had seen retreat. At the Rhine, they saw inevitability. Even in the final weeks of the war, American artillery remained decisive. Fire missions continued to be coordinated through the centralized fire direction centers. Close air support dominated daylight skies. Supply lines remained intact despite rapid advances. German formations, by contrast, were minimal. Fuel was scarce. Replacement troops were often inexperienced or drawn from Volkssturm units with minimal training. The asymmetry had widened. It was no longer a contest of maneuver alone. It was a contest to see who could keep going longer. As American units advanced deeper into Germany in April 1945, resistance fragmented. Some units fought stubbornly. Others surrendered in large numbers. The psychological transformation that began in Tunisia was complete. German soldiers confronting American forces in 1945 did not assume tactical inferiority. Many still believed in their training and discipline. But they no longer believed they could outlast the system behind the American infantrymen. The fear was not of the individual soldier. It was about the support and power behind him. Behind each rifle platoon stood artillery that could respond in minutes. Behind that stood supply convoys that rarely ran dry. Behind that stood factories that had outproduced Germany in aircraft, tanks, and ammunition by vast margins. By the time Berlin fell to Soviet forces in May 1945, American armies had advanced deep into central Germany. Cities such as Cologne, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg had fallen. The Western Front had not ended with a dramatic last stand at the Rhine. It ended with the Allies breaking through in an organized way and the German side falling apart. The Rhine had been intended as a shield. Instead, it became another step in a pattern the Germans realized only when it was too late. From Kasserine to Remagen, from retreat to encirclement, the Americans had demonstrated a capacity to absorb defeat, reorganize, and accelerate. The final barrier did not reveal American strength. It proved it. And for German officers who remembered February 1943, the contrast was stark. The army they once dismissed had become the force that crossed the Rhine and closed the Ruhr. What remained was not shock. It was acceptance that they could not win. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass, the Germans believed they had seen the truth about the American army. They saw disorganization. They saw retreat. They saw inexperience under pressure. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wrote that the Americans had not yet learned how to fight. To many in the German high command, the conclusion seemed obvious. The United States was industrially powerful, but militarily immature. And for that moment, the assessment was not irrational, but it did not tell the whole story. The Germans mistook a starting point for a ceiling. What they encountered in Tunisia was not a fully formed war machine. It was a rapidly mobilized force in its first major confrontation with seasoned Wehrmacht units. The American army in 1939 had been small, 174,000 active duty troops. By 1945, over 8 million Americans had served in uniform across all branches. 90 divisions were raised. Millions of tons of equipment were transported across the Atlantic. But the transformation was never just numerical. It was institutional. After Kasserine, command failures were not hidden. Lloyd Fredendall was removed. Dwight D. Eisenhower reorganized leadership. George S. Patton enforced discipline and cohesion. Fire direction centers standardized artillery coordination. Combined arms doctrine matured. Training intensified under combat conditions. Mistakes were turned into training guides. Defeat became a lesson. This is the core difference. The American Army treated failure as data. By 1944, institutional learning was visible everywhere. At Normandy, units adapted to the bocage by using hedgerow cutters. During Operation Cobra, they used both air power and ground attacks to break through elite German units. In France, they kept moving thanks quickly to the Red Ball Express, which used 6,000 trucks to deliver 12,000 tons of supplies each day. At Elsenborn Ridge during the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery massed hundreds of guns to halt elite SS formations. At Remagen, they seized the opportunity and crossed the Rhine before demolition plans could be fully executed. The pattern was consistent. Absorb, adapt, escalate. German officers, interviewed after the war, frequently emphasized that individual German soldiers retained confidence in close combat. They did not necessarily believe the average American infantryman was tactically superior man for man, but that comparison had become irrelevant. The war in 1944 was not decided by duels. It was decided by systems. an American infantry platoon was not isolated. Behind it stood artillery capable of responding in minutes, close air support integrated through forward controllers, motorized transport guaranteeing rapid reinforcement, standardized equipment simplifying maintenance, an industrial base producing tens of thousands of vehicles and aircraft annually. By 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 96,000 aircraft and tens of thousands of armored vehicles. German industry, under relentless Allied bombing and constrained by resource shortages, could not match output. The psychological effect was cumulative. German soldiers did not fear a single American assault. They feared that if they stopped one, another would follow, with heavier artillery, more armor, and fresh supply. The Americans did not need perfection. They needed persistence. Even during setbacks, such as the initial surprise of the Ardennes offensive, the American system reorganized rapidly. Reinforcements were shifted, artillery massed, supply chains rerouted. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was increasingly brittle. Fuel shortages constrained maneuver. Ammunition rationing limited artillery. Replacement units were often undertrained. Command decisions were constrained by Hitler's direct interference. Where the American army expanded under pressure, the German army contracted. The difference was not courage, it was capacity. German veterans frequently described American artillery as the most feared weapon on the Western Front. They described American advances as relentless. They described material superiority as overwhelming. They did not describe inevitability lightly. In 1943, the Germans asked whether Americans could fight. By 1945, they asked how long they could resist them. The transformation from Kasserine to the Rhine was not instantaneous. It was built on organizational accountability, industrial scale, logistical integration, technological adaptation, operational tempo. The Americans did not win because they were flawless. They made errors. They suffered heavy casualties, over 400,000 killed in the European theater alone. But they learned, and they scaled. The idea that Americans were weak, which seemed true in February 1943, faded as they kept learning and improving. Rommel had seen Americans retreat. Blumentritt would later describe Patton as one of the most aggressive and capable Allied commanders. Between those two assessments lay 2 years of transformation. The Germans did not ultimately fear American infantry because of nationality. They feared them because of what stood behind them. Behind every rifleman was a network. Behind every advance was industry. Behind every setback was reform. By 1945, when American forces crossed the Rhine and encircled the Ruhr, the psychological shift was complete. The army, formerly dismissed as inexperienced, had become the embodiment of modern, industrialized warfare. The real reason German soldiers feared American infantry was not a myth. It was based on organization and planning. An adaptable army, backed by an expanding industrial base, coordinated by standardized systems, sustained by logistics that rarely collapsed. In February 1943, the Germans believed they had discovered America's limits. By April 1945, they understood something much more consequential. They had discovered its capacity. And when a country's full strength is organized and put to use, it is much more dangerous than it first appears.